All right, so today we're going to continue talking about Reconstruction. This is a political cartoon we're going to look at in a minute. I want us to think about scalawags versus carpetbaggers. So let's define each. A carpetbagger is someone who moved from the north. They're both derogatory terms made up by Southerners, newspaper people. So if you're a carpetbagger, you're someone from the north who moves to the south in the aftermath of the Civil War to seek economic opportunity. And there's a lot of economic opportunity in the South because the South had been devastated. Southerners saw carpetbaggers as taking advantage of the situation. If you are a scalawag, that means you are a Southerner who is going to work with Republicans. So you're a Southerner who's working with carpetbaggers, or you're in some way working with the Reconstruction governments. If you are a freed black man in the South, you are way more likely to become a Republican, which is going to be a really interesting sort of political situation that is going to have a lot to do with who Southerners are allowed to vote. Because although they're required to ratify those voting amendments, if you are a white Southerner Democrat, you're concerned about all these new Republican voters that are suddenly there. And there are a good amount, many freed blacks who not only become registered voters, but who also serve in Southern political structures. So like the House of Representatives, like the Senate, and in state governments is what I'm trying to say. Not very successfully am I saying it. There are also going to be some improvements in education. By 1876, more than half of white children and 40% of black children attend public school. Public school had been really a sort of northern phenomenon that's going to move to the South in Reconstruction. Schools are segregated to, quote unquote, prevent false notions of equality. Most blacks and many whites don't own the land they work on. So sharecropping is going to be something that we'll be talking a little bit more about. There's also something called the crop lien system, which was a problem for blacks and also poor whites. Not very many places offered lines of credit, and those that do offer just like insane credit conditions. So many farmers don't own their land, and if they do, it's contingent upon the success of their crops. But after bad crop years, they would lose their land, which meant they lost their entire livelihood. They would end up selling it to larger landowners, working that land and becoming sharecroppers. In 1868, you have the election of Ulysses S. Grant, who's widely considered to be one of the most, he's not corrupt. His administration is widely considered to be one of the most corrupt administrations in the history of our country. He is elected in part with the help of freed blacks. He is going to win the election even though he is primaried, so he's not the only one running for the nomination. He has no political system, and so he relies on the spoils system. And if you remember from Andrew Jackson what the spoils system is, he's going to appoint people who he likes, who he knows, who he thinks he can trust. But those people don't always have A, his best interests at heart, B, the country's best interests at heart, and C, they don't always know what they're doing. Here's how the voting breakdown happens. This is a really significant scandal, the Credit Mobilier scandal, that happens during Grant's administration, which essentially sees railroad companies paying themselves through a dummy construction firm. It implicates Grant's own vice president, a man named Schuyler Colfax, in a bribery sort of scheme where he had accepted stock in this company. Also, the whiskey ring happens during his administration. This is Grant's third Treasury Secretary, a man named Benjamin Bristow, who discovers that his officials and a group of distillers are operating a whiskey ring. They're cheating the government out of excise taxes by filing false reports. The ringleader of this is discovered to be Grant's personal secretary. Grant's really hurt by this, really frustrated by this, but doesn't really seem to know what to do about it. We're also going to have something called the Panic of 1873. I've got a short little clip for you here.
Having added to his popularity in the North with new Southern support from freedmen, Grant easily won re-election in 1872, more than doubling his first margin of victory. Throughout his entire presidency, though, Grant seemed to be on cruise control in the office. Ending his day at 3, he would often take rides in his horse and buggy, play billiards, or take in the new game that was catching on across the nation, baseball. But Grant's days of leisure were about to come to a grinding halt.
The country was industrializing very rapidly. And as it was industrializing, state governments were sponsoring lots of railroad construction. Tens of millions of dollars were drained to pay these construction crews.
When one of the banks backing a second transcontinental railroad went bankrupt, economic panic swept the nation.
So there's a major depression first in 1873. That depression is catastrophic. It shakes our faith in American capitalism to its core.
The panic created what became known as the Long Depression. 20% of the country's businesses failed. A quarter of the railroad shut down, and unemployment numbers reached higher than ever before, 14%.
But the ability of the federal government in these years to actually do anything about these crises was remarkably limited. I mean, there was no stimulus plans. There was no such thing as unemployed insurance.
And at that time, President Grant says, well, why don't we think about putting people to work on public works? And he's told by future President James Garfield, that's the stupidest idea that anyone had come up with.
Congress's solution was to introduce an inflation bill that would inject more paper money into the economy. The fiscally conservative Grant responded with a veto, and the result was a political and economic stalemate.
One of the things that Grant discovered, no president can order Congress around, and so presidents who have been generals almost always become frustrated by this. Grant was expected to bring to the office of the president the same tenacious, stubborn acumen and focus on goals that he clearly brought to his role as commander-in-chief of the Union forces during the Civil War. And unfortunately for those who expected that, that was not the Grant presidency.
Okay. So what happens to Reconstruction? In the midterms of 1874, Democrats are going to win control of the House for the first time since 1861. Well, they do that to a large degree by intimidating new black voters, where they had been encouraged to vote Republican. The Democrats seek to limit their influence, and so the KKK and other sort of homegrown terrorist groups are going to actively intimidate new black voters away from the polls. White Southerners vote Democrat. White Southerners are unhappy with this idea of not being, poor white farmers often voted Democrat because they didn't want to be the lowest man on the totem pole anymore, but white Southerners in general are also voting Democrat. Some landowners are going to refuse or extend credit lines to Republicans. You have the Panic of 1873, which happens during a Republican administration. And so you also have, in the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, something that says that states can't discriminate against voters, but it's very, very rarely enforced. There's no secret ballot at this time, so everybody can see who everybody votes for if they want to. So in 1876, Republicans are going to nominate Rutherford B. Hayes. He's the 3-time governor of Ohio. He's going to call for reforms to the spoils system, which is called civil service reform. The Democrats nominate Samuel Tilden. He's also going to be anti-corruption, which is a really easy position to take if you're following up the Grant administration. But it's a very tight election, and the electoral votes are disputed. And so Congress has to settle the election. Rutherford B. Hayes, will be declared the winner in something called the Compromise of 1877. So this is the election map of 1876. So you can see how close it is. Compromise of 1877 says that at least one Southerner will be appointed to the cabinet. There will be local control over federal money, essentially. that there will be a system of internal improvements, there will be federal aid for Texas and federal aid for the Pacific Railroad, and that federal troops will be removed from the South. That is the compromise. It puts a Republican in as president, Rutherford B. Hayes, and it is the end of Reconstruction in the South. The Compromise of 1877 ends Reconstruction. It also begins the Jim Crow era, where laws are passed in the South that seek to limit as much African American influence politically and economically as possible. So we need to think about what the legacy of Reconstruction and the beginning of industrialization means for free blacks, what it means for whites, and what it means for economic development and infrastructure. Redeemers are going to come on the scene here. Redeemers are a new group of Southern aristocrats. They are committed to, quote unquote, redeeming the South through industrialization and economic development. So if you hear later on, we'll be talking about redeemer governments. That's what that means. Redeemers lower taxes, they reduce spending, but often at the expense of public education. So in the South, there's a long tradition of not embracing public education in the way that a lot of other areas perhaps have. There's an industrial focus as well in Redeemer governments, textiles, tobacco, processing, iron. There's a lot of cheap labor, there's water power, and that should say accommodating governments. I'm sure goats are very accommodating as well, but yeah, they're not the ones I'm talking about. And between 1880 and 1890, railroad tracks double in the South, but industry never reaches northern levels. So it's important to know that while Redeemer governments see industrialization as the way out of this sort of economic black hole that the South has found itself in, they don't go fully industrialized. The Southern economy is still very agricultural. Some railroad growth between 1870 and 1890, and you can see where the majority of that growth is happening. Other figures that are going to be important for us to know during Reconstruction. This is Booker T. Washington, the founder of the Tuskegee Institute and the author of the famous speech called The Atlanta Compromise, which he gives in 1865. How do freed slaves, how do free blacks in the South gain an economic voice? He says they stop focusing on political voice. They stop focusing on political equality. They focus on education and economic equality, and that political equality will come once they achieve economic success. It's obviously a very controversial stand, but because he's so focused on education, you see a lot of schools named after him. There used to be a Booker T. Washington in Memphis. It may have closed. I'm not entirely sure. And he will be opposed by others, including a man named W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed in equality now. Jim Crow, in general, is an elaborate political and social system of segregation and disenfranchisement. In 1896, a court case called Plessy v. Ferguson essentially codifies the doctrine of separate but equal being allowed in law, coming from the Board of Education, segregated schools. Many states will also issue things like poll taxes or property qualifications for voting, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. A grandfather clause says that you could vote as long as your grandfather wasn't a slave, or as long as your grandfather could vote, excuse me. So grandfather clauses and other things like this, they're going around the amendments, right, that say that you can't be excluded based on previous condition of servitude. Well, what about whether or not your grandfather could vote, right? So they're getting creative here with the language in order to deny free African Americans' rights. Under Jim Crow, blacks could not use the same restrooms, sit in the same theaters, eat at the same restaurants, ride in the same railroad cars, access public parks, beaches, picnic areas, hospitals, public safety. There's widespread violence. There is a severe lack of action on the part of law enforcement. There is lynching. There's a really important woman named Ida B. Wells, who's from Memphis, who's going to publish newspapers dedicated to bringing the victims of lynching to light. She is forced to flee. She literally is chased out of Memphis and moves to Chicago, where she continues to publish her stories. There she is. It's a plaque in Memphis dedicated to her. All right, we will continue soon.